Out of all of the stories I've heard, this is truly one of the most bizarre cases I've ever seen, and experts still question to this day what possibly could have caused this. A nation was left rattled when a man who was officially pronounced dead and was buried seemingly came back to life 18 years later. Why they did this to him is something that still shocks me, and the horrifying plot twist in this case is something you would not have expected. This is the case of Clairvius Narcisse and the concoction that caused this man to die and come back to life. In 1908, a commune by the name of Lister was founded in the Artibonite department of Haiti. It's 73 miles from the country's capital and is highlighted by its various mountains and agriculture, and it even has its fair share of urban valley as it features a local market. It's home to about 3,000 people, and included in this very small population is Clairvius Narcisse, born on January 2nd, 1922. Clairvius lived a relatively normal childhood. He had two sisters, one named Angelina, one named Mary Claire, and a brother whose name isn't known, and they would all grow up to spend their lives in their tight-knit community. While he and Angelina maintained a close relationship up until adulthood, Clairvius and his brother would instead have a falling out after an argument over land that Clairvius had refused to share. This argument would ultimately lead to the failure of their initially close relationship. Clairvius was a pretty healthy guy. He seemed to have no serious health issues growing up. However, it would be on April 30th, 1962, when Clairvius would wake up feeling extremely ill. He had this extremely high fever, he was sweating straight through his clothes, he was exhausted, and just had this general feeling of unwellness. So a concerned Clairvius would monitor his symptoms and try to use some at-home remedies to feel better, but nothing seemed to be working. In fact, he was actually getting worse. It would be finally when Clairvius would start coughing up blood when he decided, okay, I'm extremely ill, I need to go to the hospital. So quickly, Clairvius would get ready and head out the door to make a 54-minute trip down to a town called Deschapelles to admit himself into the Albert Schweitzer Hospital at 9:45 p.m. The Schweitzer Hospital was fairly new. It had only been built 6 years prior in 1956. It was ran by American doctors, and it had a plethora of services to offer. At the time, they had 80 beds, 2 operating rooms, a lab, x-ray facilities, a pharmacy. They offered laundry and food services. It was essentially the hospital of the time, and so this was the perfect place for Clairvius to get treated at. So once Clairvius gets inside and meets with the doctors, the care team would immediately start putting in the work. But to his dismay, they could not find a cause for his symptoms. For 3 straight days, he would remain in the hospital struggling as his condition would grow worse. And it would be on that 3rd day, on May 2nd, 1962, Clairvius would pass away at the age of 40. And so with a now deceased Clairvius, the doctors would place his body in a cold storage where it would stay for 20 hours. His family, including his sisters, would be contacted. An American doctor would sign his death certificate, and Mary Claire would certify it with her thumbprint. Clairvius would then be brought back to his village, where his burial would subsequently take place the next day. Angelina is now obviously devastated. Here was her presumably healthy brother now suddenly gone after dealing with such terrible symptoms out of nowhere. She would truly just go through the rest of her life simply trying to recover from this tragic loss. And after several years, Angelina, of course, misses her brother, but fortunately, being so long ago, got to a much better place in her grieving process. One day in 1980, 18 years following Clairvius' death, Angelina wakes up, heads outside, and is out and about running some errands. This was just a normal day for her. She would just go see some friends, head to the local market, nothing out of the ordinary, just regular stuff. On this particular day, though, as she is walking down the street, a man would suddenly approach her and stop her right in her tracks. Angelina is now facing this man who she's never met before and would ask, "Hey, how can I help you?" When this man would instantly reply to her, "Angelina, it's me, Clairvius." Now, this is a small village. Angelina pretty much knows everyone around here, or at least has an easy time recognizing people she knows, especially supposedly a sibling. Angelina would obviously tell this man, "Look, I have no idea who you are, but it's not cool to make up such a ridiculous story." As she would begin to walk away, this man would stop her and say, "Look, this was my childhood nickname," which to Angelina's surprise was the same childhood nickname of Clairvius. While this did catch her off guard, Angelina would reasonably point out that anyone could have possibly grew up around the family and known that that was Clairvius's nickname. Plus, this was such a minuscule detail when it was simply impossible that this was Clairvius when she quite literally buried him 18 years ago. So again, Angelina, who's clearly not entertained by this conversation, would say, "Nice try, please just go bother someone else." As she prepares to walk away, this man would say something that would not only shock her, but shock the whole entire village. He would not only share personal information about Clairvius, but he would start to share specific personal information from Clairvius's childhood. Information so personal, only someone in the Narcisse family could have possibly known about it. It was at this point a startled Angelina would immediately confirm that this man who stood in front of her was indeed her brother Clairvius. But then the number one question arose: how on earth could this be? It was just 18 years ago Clairvius was officially pronounced dead by doctors at the hospital and buried in front of her own two eyes. It made no sense that he could be standing right in front of her, seemingly alive and well. It was at this point Clairvius would go on to explain what truly happened to him. Wednesday, May 2nd, 1962, Clairvius is pronounced dead at the Schweitzer Hospital, held in a cold storage, and subsequently buried the next day. But in actuality, on that Wednesday afternoon when Clairvius was presumed dead and buried, he was in fact not dead, but rather was fully conscious, in a state of paralysis, and unable to move or say a word. So on that day, while he's being moved to a storage, placed in a coffin, and buried, Clairvius can only lay there painfully aware that he is in fact alive, and they dig his grave, his coffin is placed down, and they pile dirt on top as he frighteningly accepts his fate. Hours in this coffin would go by when Clairvius would start to notice something. Just right above his coffin, he started to hear somebody speaking. He would then just listen a little bit harder and would quickly realize that somebody was digging through his grave. After a short while, he would start to feel his coffin being lifted up from under the ground. It was at this point Clairvius had realized that somebody finally had noticed that he was in fact still alive, and they've come to save him from this terrifying ordeal. But once he is lifted up and his coffin is finally opened, Clairvius would instantly recognize what was actually going on, because the person he saw once he exited the coffin was in fact the same person responsible for putting him in that coffin in the first place. It turns out that the reason he had been paralyzed throughout his presumed death and burial was not as a result of his progressively worsening symptoms, but was rather the result of a poisoning overseen by a voodoo priest, also known as a boker, just days before he was admitted into the hospital. It would be this same boker who would dig him out, exhume his coffin, open it up, and greet a now awakened Clairvius. So Clairvius is out of his coffin, not paralyzed anymore, and is now face to face with this man who had just recently put him in this position. But before he can get to asking any questions, the boker, alongside the several men who had helped haul Clairvius out, began beating him. The boker would then immediately grab a paste out of his pocket and force it into Clairvius's mouth. Almost instantly, Clairvius started feeling woozy, and not too shortly after began hallucinating. What felt like an eternity but was only a few seconds, Clairvius started to feeling really faint, and he gradually started to lose his memory. It would be in this confused state when the boker would grab Clairvius before everything went black. The boker would then carry Clairvius away, bring him to a sugar plantation, and it would be at this field where Clairvius would be forced to work, enslaved, alongside others who had gone through the exact same thing. 2 long years would go by with Clairvius in a constant hallucinogenic state, working against his will, when Finally, the Boker priest who had kidnapped him had passed away after being beaten by one of the other prisoners who were enslaved. This had officially rendered Clairvius a free man. Clairvius would spend the next 16 years just wandering through different towns, having to work as a beggar in order to survive. And he was really just hoping to find his family. When he finally figured out how to contact them, he would start sending out letters to them, to which he would get no reply, as it was likely his family just did not believe it was him, since they quite literally watched him pass away and be buried. And after a while of searching, he was finally able to travel back to his village in Leicester, where he would bump into Angelina and explain what had happened to him over the past 2 decades. While this story may seem far-fetched, voodoo is something a lot of Haitians are very familiar with, though it's often misinterpreted, especially in Western societies, as a form of sorcery, kind of like in this case. Haitian voodoo is really a religion that was formed from the blending of West and Central African religions with Roman Catholicism. It's often cited as being influenced by those who escaped slavery, as they had goals of creating their own spiritual identity. So all this to say, because of it being a known practice, even though everyone was shocked as Clairvius would tell the story, they were able to fully believe that this actually happened. On top of this, there had been many other cases of zombies appearing around town. Around the same time in 1980, 2 women had showed up to a local village claiming to be zombies, and in northern Haiti, some villagers had claimed to see a group of zombies aimlessly wandering the fields. The only difference was that with Clairvius's case, his death had actually been documented and certified. There was actual proof of him dying and coming back to life. And so Angelina and the villagers can now only wonder what we all are thinking. Why? Why would this priest randomly select Clairvius out of all people to be turned into a zombie and forced to work on a sugar plantation? Some people would argue that it was a punishment, stating that Clairvius supposedly abandoned his children, which broke traditional behavioral codes. But Clairvius would deny these claims and state what really had happened. And this was the plot twist that absolutely blew my mind. Remember how I mentioned that Clairvius had a brother, but they had a falling out because Clairvius had refused to sell land? Well, Clairvius would go on to explain that after that argument that he had with his brother had decided to then go contact the Boker and ask if he could poison Clairvius in order to teach him a lesson. And this was why it took him so long to return to town, because he was waiting for his brother to pass away, as he felt it would have been unsafe for him to come back with him still there. So now the villagers are in shock. Story goes out everywhere. Everyone is now spreading the word of how this man was pronounced dead, came back to life as a zombie, and is now back in town 18 years later after being forced into slavery on a sugar plantation. And at this point, doctors are especially baffled because his death was officially documented on May 2nd, 1962. The doctors at Schweitzer Hospital had quite literally signed Clairvius's death certificate, and now here he stands, alive and well, right in front of them. News would make headlines not only in Haiti, but all over the world, and it had caught the attention of experts interested in this case. Wade Davis, a Canadian ethnobotanist and anthropologist who had graduated from Harvard, would make the journey down to Haiti at the request of Dr. Nathan S. Klein and Haitian psychiatrist Dr. Lamarck Doyen to investigate this mind-boggling story. They wanted to find out what could have possibly caused this man to quite literally die, become alive again, and presumably turn into a zombie. The traditional beliefs of different tribes was something that Davis was genuinely interested in learning about, and he could only think that this zombification had to be the result of some kind of local natural substance. He knew that certain plants in the area had psychoactive properties, and he was determined to figure out which one would cause such an effect. So in 1982, 2 years after Clairvius's return, Davis would make the trip to Haiti, where he would start his hunt for this drug that could have possibly caused such a phenomenon. And Dr. Klein was hopeful that Davis would successfully locate the drug, bring it back to the States for them to do some additional testing. Davis would start his investigation by meeting with the locals, just asking them what they knew about the practice. And they would all really just tell him the same thing. They told him that zombification was indeed real and that it was happening in their country, but it had nothing to do with some plant or some drug. any sort of zombification that occurred was all caused by black magic and sorcery by a boker. And so Davis would continue his investigation, hoping he could just reach one breakthrough that would reveal the use of any sort of plant, any drug, any substance, anything. And fortunately for Davis, that breakthrough did come. He had noticed that whenever bokers conducted a ritual, they would use a paste. And so he would ask about these concoctions and learn that these pastes consisted of powders of not only complex dried up plants, but also of powdered animal parts. He would then realize that there was something in those concoctions creating some type of pharmacological effect, first causing paralysis in victims and presumably leading to their zombification. And so Davis would continue his research when he finally developed his hypothesis. He claimed that the agent responsible for initially making someone appear to pass away was, in fact, a powerful neurotoxin derived from pufferfish called tetrodotoxin. He said that when given just the right amount of near-lethal dose, this neurotoxin had the ability to place somebody in a state of paralysis resembling a near-death state. He would then postulate that during that time, around April 30th, 1962, Clairvius was in fact given this tetrodotoxin containing poison. He arrives at the hospital with a high fever, fatigue, coughing up blood. As the days go by, his condition would worsen as this tetrodotoxin would progressively lower his heart rate, make his breathing faint, and severely lower his body temperature to the point where Clairvius would ultimately appear to be dead, leading to the doctors to officially document this death and have Clairvius subsequently buried. The effects of this poison would then later on wear off when the boker would exhume Clairvius's coffin, and he would then be given another dose of a completely different drug that would make him go delirious. And this drug was made from a plant called datura. And what's fascinating about this plant is that it's often known as Jimson's weed, or get this, zombie cucumber. This drug would presumably place Clairvius in a delirious zombie-like state, unable to properly think for himself, and it would be in this state of delirium where he would then be brought to the sugar plantation, where Davis can only assume Clairvius would be given regular infusions of this zombie cucumber plant, keeping him in a constant brainwashed state. It would be only after 2 long years of constant drugging and labored work when the boker would pass away, Clairvius would be able to stop these regular doses of this mind-altering drug, and he would walk away to freedom 16 long years before he finally arrives back to his home village and meets with his sister, Angelina. Many would dispute these claims, stating that this was just bad science, quite literally fraudulent, some would say. Scientists were using analytical chemistry-based tests and were essentially saying that there was no factual evidence backing up that this toxin could be prepared in such a way to create this zombifying effect. In 1986, scientists C.Y. Kayo and T. Yasumoto would conclude in their papers that tetrodotoxin turning people into zombies scientifically was just not the case. But Davis would defend his claims and stand firm in his stance that this toxin did in fact cause this zombifying effect, and that it was simply the variability in the preparations of these potions that may cause some conflicting beliefs. Ultimately, his critics were left unpersuaded, and in 1990, there was no literature to support Davis's hypothesis, though speculation online about this topic still continues to this day. I would love to know what you think about this story. Do you think tetrodotoxin and datura caused this? Do you think it was just black magic? Let me know your thoughts below, and subscribe so you don't miss any more bizarre medical cases. Thank you for watching. Bye.